Some people think a bulldozer can erase history. They usually learn the truth too late. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the roar of heavy equipment. It was the silence. The familiar hum of my hangar lights was gone. The breeze that normally carried the clean scent of fresh-cut grass across my runway had been swallowed by clouds of pale dust drifting through the cool Texas air. Then the diesel engines reached me. Low, steady, unmistakable. By the time I crested the small hill overlooking my property, the damage had already been done. My private grass airstrip looked like a construction site. Deep tire tracks carved through the runway that my father and I had spent years maintaining. Survey markers lay scattered like forgotten scraps. The bright white runway numbers had vanished beneath churned dirt and crushed limestone. Off to the side, my restored Piper Cub sat crooked inside a pile of twisted aluminum panels and broken wooden propeller pieces after a bulldozer had pushed debris across the edge of the tie-down area without a second thought. Nobody had touched the cockpit. Nobody had needed to. They had simply treated decades of aviation history like unwanted landscaping. Standing beside one of the machines was a woman wearing a cream-colored blazer that somehow stayed spotless despite the dust swirling around her expensive heels. Victoria Prescott, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She held a clipboard under one arm and smiled the way real estate agents smile when they believe they've already closed the deal. "You're welcome," she called across the property before I managed to say a single word. That abandoned landing strip was lowering property values. Our community improvement project fixes that. Community improvement. Those two words echoed louder than the bulldozers. I looked beyond her toward the freshly leveled earth where I had landed hundreds of times over the years. Every inch of that runway carried memories. My father teaching me crosswind corrections. Early Saturday mornings, checking runway lights before sunrise. Volunteers from local youth aviation programs learning their first pre-flight inspections. None of that mattered to Victoria. She saw empty land waiting to become another row of luxury homes with matching mailboxes and perfectly trimmed lawns. Around her, contractors packed up equipment while HOA board members snapped photos like they had just completed a neighborhood beautification project worthy of an award. One of them laughed as a loader rolled across the last section of flattened turf. Another pointed toward the hangar and joked that maybe they should paint it beige so it would match the subdivision. I said nothing. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Years working in aerospace engineering had taught me something important. Panic hides details. Patience finds them. As I walked toward what remained of the runway, something caught my eye beneath a mound of broken wooden stakes and fresh dirt. A weathered aluminum marker had been ripped from the ground, but not completely buried. I bent down, brushed away the dust with my sleeve, and read the faded lettering that had survived decades of sun, storms, and careless machinery. Federal aviation use. Protected easement. I looked back at Victoria as she proudly signed another document on her clipboard. She thought she had just eliminated an inconvenience. What she had actually done was leave federal evidence scattered across my property, and she didn't even know it yet. My name is Caleb Whitmore, and for most people the word airport brings to mind crowded terminals, delayed flights, and endless security lines. For me, it always meant a quiet stretch of grass just under 2,000 feet long where every sunrise felt like a promise. I am 48 years old, and I have spent more than 25 years designing aerospace systems that most people never notice but trust every time they board an airplane. My career taught me that every bolt, every checklist, and every painted line exists because someone learned an expensive lesson decades earlier. Aviation is built on discipline, patience, and documentation. Those same lessons shaped my life long before I earned my engineering license. My father, Daniel Whitmore, believed that if you wanted something to last, you built it correctly the first time and maintained it every day after that. Every Saturday morning while other kids played baseball, I walked that runway beside him carrying a measuring wheel, replacing edge markers, checking drainage ditches, and trimming grass to the exact height recommended for small aircraft operations. At the time, I thought it was nothing more than chores. Years later, I realized he had been teaching me responsibility disguised as routine. The little hangar at the end of the field became our classroom. It smelled like engine oil, fresh lumber, aviation fuel, and old coffee that had been sitting in a metal thermos since dawn. Those scents never left me. Even now, they remind me of home more than any address ever could. After my father passed away, People asked why I kept the property instead of selling it to developers who offered numbers with more zeros than I had ever imagined. The answer was simple. Some things cannot be measured in dollars. That runway carried generations of memories. Local volunteer pilots occasionally used it during emergency preparedness exercises. Student mechanics practiced inspections there. Young people who dreamed about aviation stood beside that same Piper Cub and realized airplanes were built by ordinary people willing to learn extraordinary skills. It was never a business. It was never a luxury. It was a living piece of community history quietly doing its job without asking for attention. Unfortunately, quiet places attract ambitious people who mistake patience for weakness. Cedar Ridge Estates had expanded every year since the subdivision opened. New homes replaced open fields. Decorative stone entrances appeared where cattle guards once stood. Walking trails slowly reached property lines that had been untouched for decades. Every few months another letter arrived inviting me to sell. Every offer came with polished language about progress, modernization, and improving neighborhood value. I politely declined every single one. Then the letters changed. Suddenly there were complaints about aircraft noise, even on days when no airplane had started an engine. Anonymous reports claimed my runway was abandoned. Someone even suggested the land had become a public safety concern despite the fact that it passed every inspection required for its intended use. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. None of those complaints were really about airplanes. They were laying the foundation for something much larger. I simply did not realize how far someone was willing to go until I found fresh bulldozer tracks cutting across the place my family had protected for generations. Victoria Prescott had the remarkable ability to make every unreasonable decision sound like a public service. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her confidence did all the work. At 53 years old, she had spent nearly 2 decades selling luxury homes across Central Texas before becoming president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Around the neighborhood, people described her as organized, determined, and passionate about protecting property values. Those who had lived there longer used different words when nobody else was listening. Controlling, calculating, patient. Victoria understood something most bullies never figure out. Real power does not come from shouting. It comes from convincing everyone else that you are simply following the rules. Her white sport utility vehicle seemed to appear everywhere. Outside board meetings, near construction sites, parked beside homes receiving violation notices. She carried a leather binder thick enough to impress anyone who confused paperwork with authority, and she quoted sections of neighborhood covenants the way other people quoted favorite movies. New homeowners admired her efficiency. Older residents quietly avoided eye contact whenever she walked by. I first met her 3 years after Cedar Ridge expanded toward my property. She arrived at my hangar wearing sunglasses that reflected the afternoon sun so brightly I could barely see her eyes. She smiled, admired the view for exactly 5 seconds, then asked if I had ever considered selling because, in her words, this land had much greater potential as a premium residential community than an outdated private landing field. I politely told her the property was not on the market. She laughed as though I had made a harmless joke and handed me her business card anyway. From that day forward, every conversation followed the same pattern. She proposed. I declined. She smiled. Then another problem mysteriously appeared a few weeks later. A complaint about overgrown grass, even though the runway met aviation maintenance standards. Questions about drainage despite county inspections showing everything functioned perfectly. Anonymous concerns that airplanes were disturbing neighborhood peace, although my flight logs showed only occasional operations during daylight hours. The timing became almost predictable. Every time another section of Cedar Ridge sold out, another complaint landed in my mailbox. At community meetings, Victoria stood beside colorful development maps and talked about the future. Walking trails, community parks, outdoor gathering spaces, families enjoying open green areas. Whenever someone asked where those new amenities would fit, her eyes drifted toward my property for just a fraction of a second before returning to the audience. Most people never noticed. I did. She was planting an idea long before anyone questioned her intentions. To her, my runway was not a functioning aviation facility with decades of documented history. It was an obstacle interrupting the perfect shape of her master plan. The strange part was that she never once asked about the legal status of the property. She never requested aviation records. She never spoke with county officials responsible for airport registrations. She simply assumed that if enough people repeated the same story, the truth would eventually become irrelevant. Standing there that dusty morning while contractors loaded their equipment onto trailers, Victoria looked completely satisfied. She believed she had finally removed the last piece standing between her neighborhood and its expansion. Watching her congratulate board members, I realized something that made me strangely calm. She had spent years studying subdivision maps. I had spent my entire career studying engineering drawings, federal documentation, and systems where every detail mattered. One of us had overlooked something, and judging by the aluminum marker resting quietly in my hand, it was not me. The weeks that followed felt less like a neighborhood disagreement and more like a carefully planned campaign. It started with small inconveniences that would have sounded ridiculous if I had described them to anyone outside Cedar Ridge Estates. Bright orange survey flags suddenly appeared along the edge of my runway without explanation. Temporary construction fencing blocked the service road leading to my hangar for 2 days before quietly disappearing overnight. One Monday morning, I found a laminated notice tied to my gate claiming the surrounding area had been designated for future community infrastructure improvements and asking all unauthorized vehicles to avoid the site. Unauthorized vehicles. They were talking about my own truck parked on my own property. I called the number printed at the bottom of the notice. A cheerful receptionist informed me that the Homeowners Association was coordinating improvements designed to enhance neighborhood safety and accessibility. When I explained that the road and runway belonged to me, she politely suggested I attend the next board meeting. I did. The meeting room smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet. Neighbors filled folding chairs while Victoria stood beside a projector displaying colorful renderings of walking paths, decorative landscaping, and a community recreation area. My property appeared on the map as a blank green rectangle labeled Future Expansion Zone. I raised my hand and calmly pointed out that the land was privately owned and actively maintained. Victoria smiled without looking surprised. She thanked me for my comments, assured everyone that all necessary legal reviews had already taken place, then immediately moved to the next agenda item before anyone could ask another question. Several people nodded as if that settled everything. Others avoided looking at me entirely. Over the next month, certified letters arrived almost every week. One claimed my runway lighting created unnecessary visual pollution despite the fact that the lights had not been powered in months. Another questioned drainage patterns after a spring rain even though county engineers had inspected the property the previous year. Then came a notice alleging that unused aviation facilities reduced nearby home values. Every accusation carried the same polite language and the same quiet assumption that I would eventually give up. Instead, I documented everything. Every envelope, every timestamp, every photograph, every conversation. Years in aerospace engineering had taught me that records outlive opinions. Then one Thursday afternoon, my neighbor, Harold Simmons, drove over in his dusty pickup truck. Harold had lived beside the runway for nearly 30 years. He stepped out holding his hat instead of wearing it, which immediately told me something was wrong. In a low voice, he said he had overheard contractors discussing a grading project scheduled for the following Tuesday, while I would be attending an aerospace conference in Dallas. They believed the runway had already been cleared for redevelopment. Harold looked genuinely uneasy. He told me he had tried explaining that airplanes still occasionally used the field, but nobody wanted to hear it. According to the foreman, all approvals had already been signed. I thanked Harold, then called the engineering company listed on one of the project signs. The receptionist confirmed they had received complete documentation authorizing site preparation and referred me back to the Homeowners Association for further questions. By the time I reached Victoria's office, she had already left for the day. As I locked my hangar that evening, the fading sunlight reflected across my airplane one last time. Something about the stillness in the air felt different. Not peaceful, deliberate, like an approaching storm that had already decided exactly where it intended to land. I spent the next 48 hours doing everything the right way because that is how engineers solve problems. I called the county planning office. I requested copies of every permit connected to my property. I scheduled meetings instead of making accusations. The woman behind the records counter recognized my address immediately. She pulled several folders from a cabinet, adjusted her glasses, and frowned. Every construction permit she could find. Stopped at the Cedar Ridge property line. Nothing authorized work on my runway. Nothing approved grading my land. Nothing mentioned removing aviation facilities. She quietly slid the papers across the counter and said, "If someone worked beyond the permitted boundary, that is outside our jurisdiction, you may need legal counsel." That sounded encouraging until I actually hired an attorney. He studied the photographs, reviewed the notices from the Homeowners Association, and sighed the way experienced lawyers do when they realize a simple case has become expensive. His recommendation was to file an injunction and prepare for months of litigation. Months. By then the runway was already gone. The airplane already needed restoration all over again. Court orders could stop future work, but they could not restore what had already disappeared beneath heavy equipment. I contacted the sheriff's office hoping someone would at least document the damage. The deputy who arrived was respectful and professional. He walked the property with me, photographed the equipment tracks, and listened carefully while I explained the history of the runway. Then he gave the answer I had begun hearing from everyone. This appears to be a civil property dispute. Civil property dispute. Those 4 words felt heavier than the crushed limestone beneath my boots. Victoria had counted on exactly that response. As long as every agency believed this was merely an argument between neighbors, she stayed comfortably ahead. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge newsletters celebrated the beginning of what they called Phase 2 community improvements. Artist renderings showed families walking along tree-lined paths exactly where my runway had existed only days earlier. Social media posts praised the board for eliminating an abandoned eyesore. Reading those comments was strangely surreal because I had flown from that field only 3 weeks before. An abandoned runway does not receive fuel deliveries. An abandoned runway does not have current maintenance logs. An abandoned runway does not pass inspections. Facts no longer seemed to matter. Public perception had become more powerful than documentation. Even Harold admitted that several neighbors believed Victoria's version because it sounded organized and official. One evening I unlocked the damaged hangar and sat beside the piper as the setting sun painted long orange shadows across the concrete floor. The familiar smell of aviation oil mixed with fresh dirt drifting in through the open doors. My father used to say that whenever something in aviation looked simple, you had probably missed an important detail. I kept hearing those words over and over. Something refused to fit. Victoria had moved too quickly. Contractors normally demanded proof before crossing private property. Engineering firms usually verified boundaries. Insurance companies rarely ignored registered facilities. Too many experienced professionals had acted with complete confidence. Confidence had to come from somewhere. I spread every document I owned across my old wooden workbench. Property surveys, tax records, maintenance logs, flight records, easement maps, receipts dating back decades. For hours nothing stood out except dust collecting beneath the hangar lights. Then my eyes stopped on a faded reference number printed in the corner of an engineering drawing. It was not a county file number. It was not a state permit number either. I had seen that format before, years earlier, while working on federal aviation infrastructure projects. Suddenly, the aluminum marker I had recovered from the dirt no longer felt like a forgotten relic. It felt like the first piece of a puzzle that everyone else had walked past without ever bothering to read. Sleep never came that night. Instead, I unlocked every dusty filing cabinet inside the hangar and began searching through boxes my father had labeled in neat black marker decades earlier. Most people keep family photographs in storage. We kept engineering drawings, inspection reports, survey maps, and maintenance logs. The papers smelled faintly of dust, machine oil, and old cardboard that had absorbed Texas summers for more than 40 years. Around midnight, I found a thick blue binder marked Airfield Development Archive. My pulse slowed. Whenever my father used blue binders, it meant the contents had passed more than one level of review. Inside were yellowed engineering plans stamped with dates from the late 1960s, correspondence between civil engineers and aviation officials, environmental studies, drainage calculations, and handwritten notes describing runway improvements that had taken years to complete. Then I found the document that changed everything. Attached to the original survey was a recorded aviation easement identifying the runway as part of a federally recognized aviation support corridor established under an infrastructure preservation program. The legal language was precise. The land remained privately owned, but specific portions supporting aviation operations carried federal protections that local organizations could not alter without formal authorization. My father had never mentioned it because, in his generation, people assumed official records would always protect themselves. They never imagined someone would simply ignore them. I carried the binder to my office computer and entered the reference number from the engineering drawing into the Federal Aviation Administration records database. The search returned an active file. My runway was still listed. The protected easement remained valid. Historical improvements had been documented. Inspection history stretched back decades. Even the coordinates matched the weathered aluminum marker I had pulled from the dirt after the bulldozers left. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen while the cooling fan inside my computer hummed through the quiet hangar. Every complaint, every violation notice, every construction meeting suddenly looked different. Victoria had never challenged my ownership. She had built her entire plan on the assumption that nobody would notice another layer of jurisdiction sitting beneath the property line shown on subdivision maps. The next morning, I drove to a retired surveyor named Walter Briggs, the same man who had helped my father update boundary records years earlier. Walter examined the documents without saying much. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, removed his reading glasses, and smiled the way experienced professionals smile when a mystery finally makes sense. He tapped the easement with one finger and said, "This is why every serious survey begins with history instead of assumptions." They measured the neighborhood. They never measured the law. Before leaving, Walter handed me certified copies of archived plats, complete coordinate references, and a list of federal recording numbers that matched every document in my binder. As I organized the growing stack of evidence across my workbench, something inside me changed. Until that moment, I had been trying to defend what had already been damaged. Now I understood I was holding proof that the entire project had crossed a legal boundary nobody involved had bothered to verify. The bulldozers had flattened a runway, but they had also uncovered the one document capable of bringing every confident decision to a complete stop. For the first time since the bulldozers crossed my runway, I stopped trying to convince people I was right. The evidence no longer needed my emotions. It only needed the right destination. I spent the next 2 days building a case the same way I had prepared engineering certification packages throughout my career. Every photograph was labeled with the exact time it had been taken. Every damaged location matched a survey coordinate. Every document referenced the next one so that anyone reviewing the file could follow the timeline without asking a single question. The thick stack of papers on my workbench grew into something that looked less like a lawsuit and more like an engineering audit. I added copies of county permits, historical surveys, maintenance records, inspection logs, aerial photographs, contractor advertisements, and the archived federal easement Walter had helped me verify. I even included weather reports showing the exact conditions on the day construction crews entered the property. Details matter because details survive arguments. Once everything was organized, I made 3 identical binders. One remained locked inside my office safe. One went to my attorney. The third was addressed to the regional office responsible for aviation infrastructure compliance. I mailed it without fanfare on a quiet Tuesday morning. No threatening letters. No dramatic speeches. No social media posts. Just certified delivery with signature confirmation. Then I went back to work. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge celebrated. New signs appeared along the freshly graded land announcing the future location of a community recreation park. Survey crews returned to take additional measurements. Decorative stone samples lined the edge of what used to be my taxiway. One afternoon, I watched from my porch as Victoria walked the site with several contractors, pointing confidently toward different sections while smiling for promotional photographs. She looked completely relaxed. She believed every important decision had already been made. Even some neighbors stopped by to suggest I move on. They told me lawsuits were expensive and life was too short to fight City Hall. I simply thanked them for their concern. They assumed my silence meant defeat. In reality, silence had become part of the plan. About 3 weeks after I mailed the package, my phone rang while I was recalibrating avionics equipment inside the hangar. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Lawson from the Regional Aviation Compliance Office. Her voice remained calm and professional as she confirmed my address and asked whether the property had experienced any additional construction activity since my submission. I answered every question carefully. She never offered opinions. She never promised outcomes. Before ending the call, she asked me to preserve every remaining marker, photograph, and document because multiple departments would likely require independent verification. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. My file had moved beyond an ordinary complaint. 2 mornings later, I noticed unfamiliar sport utility vehicles parked along the county road near my property. Nobody activated emergency lights. Nobody announced their arrival. Several people wearing reflective safety vests quietly examined survey markers, compared printed maps against handheld equipment, and photographed the graded runway from multiple angles. They spoke very little, but they measured everything. Across the fence, Victoria continued discussing landscaping plans with her contractors, completely unaware that every confident step she took now unfolded beneath the careful attention of people who were no longer interested in neighborhood opinions. They were interested in records, coordinates, signatures, and federal documentation, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, those were the only things that truly mattered. Everything changed without a single raised voice. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic confrontations, and no television cameras parked outside the neighborhood entrance. Real investigations rarely look exciting from a distance. They look quiet, methodical, precise. Over the next several days, the unfamiliar vehicles returned one after another. Survey crews walked the former runway carrying measuring equipment instead of opinions. Engineers compared archived plats against fresh field measurements. Environmental specialists photographed drainage channels that had been altered during the grading work. Every few hours, another clipboard filled with notes disappeared into another government vehicle. The only sound was the steady click of camera shutters, the soft buzz of laser measuring equipment, and the wind moving through the tall oak trees that had watched over that runway for generations. Victoria tried to treat the visitors like any other contractors. I watched her approach one group, carrying copies of Homeowners Association paperwork inside her familiar leather binder. She pointed confidently towards subdivision maps and smiled the same polished smile that had convinced so many people before. One of the investigators accepted the documents politely, glanced through a few pages, thanked her, and returned to comparing federal survey coordinates against the original easement records. He never argued. He simply continued documenting what was physically there instead of what anyone believed should have been there. By the end of that week, bright temporary markers appeared around the disturbed sections of land. Construction equipment that had been scheduled to return never arrived. The entrance sign promoting the future recreation area quietly disappeared overnight. Contractors who had previously worked every morning stopped answering questions from curious neighbors. Even the atmosphere inside Cedar Ridge seemed different. Conversations became whispers. Window blinds moved whenever unfamiliar vehicles entered the subdivision. Then official letters began arriving. Mine came by certified mail in a thick envelope confirming that multiple agencies had opened coordinated reviews regarding activities affecting protected aviation infrastructure. My attorney received similar correspondence requesting additional documentation that we had already organized weeks earlier. According to public county records, several permits connected to the redevelopment project were placed under administrative review pending jurisdictional findings. Nobody announced guilt. Nobody rushed to conclusions. The process simply continued exactly as federal procedures are designed to continue, one verified fact at a time. Victoria's confidence slowly faded. I saw it the afternoon she walked toward the former runway carrying another stack of documents. She stopped halfway across the field after noticing fresh survey stakes marked with federal reference numbers instead of local construction codes. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked uncertain. Not frightened, just confused. She kept turning pages inside her binder as though the answer had to be written somewhere she had overlooked. The answer had always been there. It had been recorded decades before either of us ever owned property in that county. She had trusted colorful subdivision maps. The investigators trusted archived aviation records that stretched back more than half a century. Those two realities finally collided on the same piece of land. Standing beside my damaged hangar, I realized something my father understood all along. Concrete can be poured in a single day. Grass can be flattened in a single afternoon. Even airplanes can be repaired with enough patience. But official records preserved by generations of careful engineers have a way of outlasting every shortcut. Quietly, steadily, and without ever needing to raise their voices, they were restoring the truth one document at a time. Nearly a year passed before the runway welcomed another airplane, but that first landing sounded more beautiful than any applause I had ever heard. The gentle hum of the engine drifted across the morning air long before the tires touched the fresh grass. The wheels rolled smoothly over a rebuilt surface measured, graded, and restored according to the same engineering standards my father had respected decades earlier. The smell of newly cut grass mixed with aviation fuel once again, replacing the dusty scent of construction that had lingered for months. Standing beside the hangar, I closed my eyes for just a second and listened. Some sounds tell you everything without saying a word. The investigation eventually became public through official records instead of neighborhood rumors. Multiple construction approvals connected to the redevelopment project were withdrawn after jurisdictional reviews confirmed that protected aviation interests had been ignored. Restoration costs were assigned through the legal process, damaged improvements were documented, and the property was returned to the condition required under the applicable agreements. The details filled hundreds of pages that most people would never read, but one conclusion remained remarkably simple. Assumptions are never stronger than recorded facts. Cedar Ridge quietly removed every promotional rendering showing parks and walking paths across my land. The decorative signs disappeared. The grading equipment never returned. Contractors moved on to other projects where the property boundaries actually matched the paperwork. Victoria Prescott resigned from the Homeowners Association several months later. I never celebrated that decision because it was never about defeating a person. It was about correcting a mistake that should never have happened in the first place. The strange thing about justice is that it rarely feels loud when it finally arrives. It feels quiet, orderly, almost ordinary. One afternoon, Harold drove over with a thermos of coffee and leaned against the fence watching a group of local teenagers participate in an aviation education day that we had finally restarted. They laughed while learning how to read weather charts, inspect control surfaces, and respect the discipline that flying demands. Harold smiled and said the runway looked like it had never disappeared at all. I looked toward the weathered aluminum marker that now stood mounted inside a protective display near the entrance of the hangar, instead of buried beneath dirt. I had cleaned every scratch from its surface, but I never polished away the scars left by the machinery. They served as a reminder that history deserves to be remembered exactly as it happened. A new sign stood beside the entrance road where visitors could easily read it before driving another inch. It identified the aviation easement, referenced the official recording information, and reminded anyone entering that infrastructure protected by law is not protected because someone is powerful. It is protected because generations before us understood its value and took the time to document it correctly. Sometimes people ask whether I ever wanted revenge after everything that happened. The answer has always been no. Revenge fades. Records remain. Every time I hear an airplane settle gently onto that runway, I think about my father handing me a measuring wheel on those early Saturday mornings and reminding me that careful work always outlasts shortcuts. He was right then, and he is still right now. Justice is not loud. It does not need to shout across a courtroom or argue at a neighborhood meeting. It waits patiently inside the facts until someone is willing to read them carefully. And in the end, the truth landed exactly where it belonged.